She called the cops on me while standing behind a fence she built on my land, then screamed for help when they told her to take it down. That's when I smiled, handed over my credentials, and said the words she never saw coming. I'm the guy who marked these lot lines 15 years ago. The madness began on a Saturday morning just after sunrise. I was out front with a mug of coffee in one hand and pruning shears in the other, planning to give the hedges some long overdue attention. The air was crisp, birds were chirping, and for a moment, it felt like a peaceful day. Then I heard it, the unmistakable metallic thud of a post driver. I turned my head and froze. A construction crew in neon vests was slamming wooden fence posts straight through the middle of my front garden. My hydrangeas, my freshly reseeded lawn, being stomped flat by muddy boots. And standing beside them, hands on hips and sunglasses perched like a villain in a soap opera, was Agnes. She didn't even flinch when I walked up. In fact, she gave me that trademark smirk of hers, tight-lipped and gleaming with passive aggression. "Good morning," she chirped, as if we were exchanging muffins. I asked her what in the world was going on. She waved the laminated map in my face like a game show host revealing the grand prize. "Hoa expansion," she said, pointing to a bold red outline. "We are reclaiming the green belt space for the community garden." I blinked. "That's my yard," I replied. "Not anymore," she smiled. I should have lost it. I should have shouted, cursed, maybe grabbed a shovel and started swinging. But instead, I just stared. Not because I was scared, because I was stunned at how boldly wrong she was. That fence wasn't even close to the property line. It was 11 feet into my yard, including my water line, flower beds, and the side path that led to my garage. It was so egregious that part of it actually blocked my outdoor faucet. When I pointed this out, she said, "Well, that's something you'll have to adapt to." Rather than argue, I told her I needed to check something in my garage. She laughed and told me to make peace with change. What she didn't know, and what no one in this neighborhood knew, was that I was a licensed land surveyor with 20 years of experience. I helped lay out the utility easements and original plots when this neighborhood was first developed, and I had the records to prove it. Inside the garage, I climbed up to the rafters and pulled down a plastic tub covered in sawdust. Inside was my old surveying briefcase, complete with blueprints, signed lot documents, and my credentials. I wiped the dust off the cover, feeling that mix of righteous fury and cold focus you only get when someone thinks they've played. You know you're about to checkmate them in 5 moves. Back outside, I watched as Agnes directed the workers to install a gaudy little sign, "Community Garden Coming." Soon, it looked like it belonged at a farmer's market, complete with flower decals and a cartoon tomato. I stood there silently, watching her pose in front of it like it was a ribbon-cutting ceremony. A few neighbors walked by, some offering hesitant smiles, clearly unsure what to make of it. One even said, "Looks great, Agnes," before glancing at me nervously like he complimented the wrong side in a war. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just took pictures, lots of them. Every post, every angle, every crushed flower bed and broken brick. I documented where the original property marker stakes had been before they were ripped up. I used a measuring tape, my old GPS handheld unit, and even reinstalled a couple of temporary markers. The fence was off by nearly a dozen feet on all sides, and I had the proof. Agnes thought she was invincible because of her seat on the hoe. What she didn't realize is that she just trespassed, destroyed personal property, and initiated a property line dispute, all without legal grounds. Over the next few days, Agnes strutted through the neighborhood like she was running for mayor. She hosted a lemonade stand on the very patch of land she stole, invited kids to future garden planting, and even tried to get me to sign a paper acknowledging the boundary adjustment. I didn't sign it. I barely spoke, just smiled, nodded, and quietly filed a formal complaint with the county. The funniest part? She thought I was intimidated. She would wave at me in the mornings with that patronizing be the bigger person energy, thinking I was too passive or confused to challenge her. But what I was really doing was building a case so airtight it could survive a tornado. I pulled the original developer's plat maps from my archives. I reviewed the GPS coordinates I had stored from my work a decade ago. I even scheduled a drone flyover to verify the encroachments from the air. By the end of that week, I had everything. And Agnes, she had a crooked fence, a trail of documented violations, and a date with the county land office she didn't even know was coming. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted this to be educational for her, for the HOA, and for every neighbor who watched her bully her way through committee meetings and yard disputes, like she was the queen of deed restrictions. So I started printing signs, not tacky ones like hers, but clean, official-looking ones. The first one went up near the fence, surveyed and verified. Private property. Documentation filed with county recorder. The second one went on my garage, surveyor on site. All property boundaries GPS marked. I mounted a motion sensor camera facing the stolen land and set it to auto-upload. Agnes's confusion was delicious. She stormed across the lawn and accused me of intimidation. I replied with a single sentence, just protecting my property. By the end of the day, her voice was hoarse from shouting, and I was sipping tea on my porch, laptop open, watching the camera feed and GPS overlays line up perfectly. I didn't need to scream. The truth, the law, and the geometry were already screaming louder than she ever could. And soon enough, they drowned her out completely. A few days after Agnes's fence stunt, things got even weirder. She wasn't just acting like she owned the land. She was now managing it like she was the mayor of a botanical kingdom. Every morning around 8 a.m., she'd strut into my yard, yes, my yard with a clipboard, wearing gardening gloves, and issue orders to whoever was unfortunate enough to be helping her that day. I watched in stunned silence as she marked chalk lines across the grass, measured plots with a tape measure, and set down little flags with names like herbs, tomatoes, and, bizarrely, executive chair area. She even had the nerve to hammer a stick into the ground right beside my water spigot and attach a sign that read, "Future irrigation tap HOA access only." That's when I knew she wasn't just delusional. She was planning to make this permanent. What baffled me even more was how confident she was. It was as if she truly believed she had every legal right to do what she was doing. Maybe she was used to pushing around people who didn't know the rules. Maybe she had gotten away with this kind of thing before, using her charm and petty power plays to claim an inch here and a foot there, until it added up to a stolen yard. But she didn't know who she was dealing with now. Not a retired couple who'd rather avoid conflict, not a renter afraid of eviction. She had picked a fight with the guy who literally mapped this neighborhood, who still had digital coordinates from the original site markers saved on a hard drive, and who knew every inch of slope, setback, and survey law better than anyone in the HOA. Still, I kept my head down and played it cool. I wasn't just documenting now, I was planning something much bigger. I charged up my drone, the one I used to use for professional site scans, and prepped it for a low-altitude survey. It wasn't just for photos. It had LiDAR scanning. That meant I could digitally recreate every inch of my property and overlay it on the recorded lot lines. I launched it at sunrise 2 days later, making sure it followed the legal flight path and never crossed into anyone else's yard. The drone buzzed overhead, quiet but efficient, while I sat on my porch with a coffee and a grin. Agnes came storming out in her robe, shaking a rake at the sky like she was in some medieval drama. "You're invading my airspace," she shouted. I calmly told her that it wasn't her airspace. In fact, according to FAA rules, she didn't even have jurisdiction over 5 feet above her house. I even showed her the certificate taped to the controller, FAA registered commercial drone use. She huffed and called someone on the phone, pacing back and forth while waving her arms in the air like a traffic marshal. That evening, I compiled the drone data and matched it against my original records. The fence was even worse than I thought. On one side, she had encroached 12.5 feet past the property line. On the other, nearly 10. Her so-called community garden would have included part of my garage foundation and a corner of my deck. I printed out high-resolution aerial maps, annotated them with red lines, and assembled a binder thicker than a phone book. Every photo, every scan, every inch of stolen land was now recorded, organized, and time-stamped. I titled it Exhibit A. Then came the HOA meeting. Once a month, the HOA gathered in the clubhouse, a room that looked like it was designed by a committee of beige enthusiasts. Folding chairs, a cheap podium, and a projector that hadn't been replaced since 2008. But tonight, it was packed. Agnes had sent out flyers bragging about her community beautification project and promising free donuts for anyone who showed up in support. I sat quietly near the back, binder in hand, while Agnes strutted to the front like she was headlining a TED Talk. She started her presentation with a slide that read, "Reclaiming Unused Land, a Vision for a Greener Tomorrow." The next few slides were filled with stock photos of vegetables, kids with watering cans, and Google images of communal gardens in other cities. She spoke in a rehearsed tone, referencing the HOA Charter, environmental benefits, and the moral duty of reclaiming underutilized spaces. Then she flashed a poorly drawn map with a giant red square over my yard. "In this," she said, tapping the screen with a long pointer stick, "is where we begin." I waited patiently. When the moderator asked if anyone had concerns, I raised my hand. Agnes rolled her eyes. "Of course," she muttered. I stepped up and placed my binder on the podium. Then I projected my drone images, lot overlays, and GPS surveys. The room fell silent. I pointed out the exact boundaries, showed time-lapse footage of the fence construction, and cited zoning regulations that Agnes had violated. Then I dropped the bomb. Not only is this fence illegal, it violates county code and will subject the HOA to liability if it's not removed. That got their attention. A couple of board members leaned in. Someone near the back gasped. Agnes's smile vanished. She tried to interrupt, but the moderator asked her to wait. I finished with a calm explanation of my credentials, including a copy of my original contract with the housing developer and certification number from the state surveyor board. Then I handed the binder to the secretary and said, "You want to keep this on file." Agnes exploded. She accused me of falsifying data, claimed I had a personal vendetta, and even suggested I was lying about my credentials. But her voice was shaking, and everyone could see it. One board member asked if she had independent documentation of the new boundary lines. She didn't. She just stammered something about a draft HOA map and a consensus understanding from last year's holiday mixer. It was a disaster. The board agreed to conduct an independent survey. Agnes protested, but it was over. I had forced their hand with facts, law, and logic. That night, as the room cleared and the leftover donuts sat uneaten, Agnes stomped past me without a word. Her face was red, her hands clenched, and for the first time since this began, she looked genuinely nervous. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The look in her eyes told me she knew something had shifted. This wasn't about control or appearances anymore. This was about legal consequences, real ones. And the more she pushed, the deeper the hole she was digging. She just didn't realize how close she was to the bottom. Not yet, but she would soon. By the end of the week, the independent surveyor hired by the HOA arrived, clipboard in hand and GPS receiver strapped to his belt. I watched from my porch with a steaming cup of tea, pretending to scroll my phone while secretly enjoying every second. Agnes, on the other hand, looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. She marched over in her pink floral windbreaker, demanding to see his credentials, asking how long he'd been surveying, and trying to sneak glances at his paperwork. The man was polite but firm, letting her know that interference during an official boundary check could be reported as obstruction. That quieted her for a moment. As the surveyor walked the perimeter, he paused at each of the old marker spots I had ray-flagged, double-checking them with the recorded lot records on his tablet. Agnes kept circling like a hawk, muttering things about new HOA ordinances and community-approved adjustments. But none of it mattered. After nearly 2 hours of careful measurement, he packed up his gear, signed a few papers, and told the HOA rep that the fence was absolutely out of line, literally and legally. Agnes's eyes widened. She tried to argue. "That map is wrong," she said, jabbing a finger toward the surveyor's tablet. "The HOA has a newer version." The man gave her a polite smile and replied, "This is the county-registered version, ma'am." It overrides any internal HOA diagrams. That night, the HOA sent a formal notice to Agnes: remove the fence within 14 days or face a fine of up to $2. 0 per day for every day it remains standing. Instead of accepting the decision, Agnes doubled down. She called an emergency HOA meeting, rallied the few loyal neighbors she hadn't annoyed yet, and started spreading rumors that I had bribed the surveyor, that I was manipulating GPS data, and even that my original work with the developer had been tainted by bias. She went door to door with photocopies of her own hand-drawn map, complete with red arrows and sticky notes reading, "My land." But her campaign was starting to crack. A few neighbors who had once smiled politely when she passed by now avoided her entirely. Some began quietly reaching out to me, asking if she had tried similar things with their lots. One elderly couple revealed she had tried to reroute their fence for symmetry. Another neighbor said she'd once told them their garden statue violated aesthetic guidelines, only to find out no such rule existed. The stories trickled in, and the more I heard, the more I realized Agnes had been slowly claiming inches, then feet, for years, confident no one would challenge her. Then, in a move that surprised even me, Agnes decided to fix the issue herself without permits, without professional help, and, most importantly, without telling anyone. Under the cover of darkness, she brought in a couple of unlicensed workers in an unmarked truck. I watched from my window as they cut into the fence, sawed off sections, and rain-nailed them further back. It was a patchwork job, sloppy and uneven, but it showed intent to comply, or so it seemed. In reality, she had only moved it back a few feet, still well within my property lines, and now violating the county-mandated setback from the sidewalk. I didn't intervene. I simply checked my camera footage the next morning and saved everything. The footage clearly showed unauthorized nighttime construction and trespassing. I sent it to the county inspector along with updated GPS measurements and time-stamped images. By midweek, a new notice was posted on the fence. Violation escalated. Immediate removal required. Agnes ripped it down, called the HOA screaming, and then tried to call the surveyor's office to have his license reviewed, which went nowhere. Sensing she was losing control, Agnes tried to rally her final card, public sympathy. She staged a garden community day on the freshly stolen land, complete with folding tables, cheap snacks, and a few plastic planters filled with wilting herbs. She even brought in a few neighborhood kids and had them paint signs that said things like, "Plants bring us together, and let the garden grow." It was the most awkward hostage situation I'd ever seen, with toddlers playing tag around a fence that was technically a criminal violation. I didn't crash the event. I didn't even approach. Instead, I sent the footage and photos to a local real estate blog known for exposing absurd HOA behavior. By the next day, the story went semi-viral. HOA president builds garden on neighbor's land. Gets schooled by surveyor. The post included side-by-side aerials from my drone and the official plat maps, along with a quote from the county land office confirming the violation. The comments were brutal. People from across the country chimed in with their own Agnes horror stories. Some laughed, some fumed, but everyone agreed she had picked the wrong fight. When Agnes found out, she was livid. She accused me of slander, of manipulating the media, and of trying to embarrass a public servant. But there was nothing to sue over. Everything was documented. Everything was factual. Her final desperate move was to threaten a lawsuit, claiming I had defamed her leadership position in the HOA. I responded with a short letter, 1 paragraph, 3 lines long. It simply read, "Any further legal threats will be forwarded to my attorney. In the meantime, remove your fence. You have 5 days left." On day 4, the county showed up again, this time with a work crew and an order signed by the local zoning commissioner. Agnes wasn't home when they arrived. I watched from my porch as they dismantled every panel of that fence and stacked it neatly on her driveway. They took pictures, signed paperwork, and even marked the ground with bright orange spray paint indicating the correct lot line. When Agnes returned home and saw the bare dirt and her fence piled up like a lumber sale, she screamed loud enough to scare a flock of birds from a nearby tree. She marched straight to my porch demanding an apology, claiming emotional distress, and threatening civil action. I stood up, looked her in the eyes, and calmly replied, "Agnes, I don't just know where the line is. I am the line." She stormed off in silence, defeated but still too proud to admit it. But the battle wasn't quite over yet. She had one more move, and I had a feeling she was desperate enough to play it. I could see it in her eyes, the stubborn flicker of someone who couldn't accept that they'd lost. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't just prepared for her next move. I was already 5 steps ahead. And the next step wasn't just about property lines. It was about tearing down everything she thought she controlled. It started with a letter. A white envelope slipped into my mailbox with no return address, but the unmistakable aura of someone trying to sound official without actually having authority. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in a bizarre mix of legal-sounding jargon and passive-aggressive flair. Agnes had filed a formal complaint against me to the HOA board, accusing me of emotional harassment, neighborly intimidation, and creating a hostile community environment. She had even attached a printed-out photo of one of my survey signs and circled the words "private property" in red marker, claiming it was psychologically threatening. I chuckled. Then I read the second line. She was requesting that I be fined, silenced in HOA meetings, and prohibited from installing any new signage without board review. That's when I stopped laughing. What Agnes didn't realize was that by trying to turn the HOA against me, she'd just thrown gasoline onto a fire she had no clue how to control. Because the truth was, she wasn't the only one with receipts. Over the past few weeks, neighbors who had once been too afraid or too annoyed to confront her were starting to talk. One elderly woman named Mrs. Jansen walked up to me while I was mowing my lawn and quietly asked, "Did she ever try to move your mailbox?" Apparently, 2 years ago, Agnes had insisted that Mrs. Jansen's mailbox didn't match HOA's standards and replaced it without permission. When the woman asked for it back, Agnes claimed it had been discarded for recycling. Another neighbor admitted Agnes told him his driveway paint color violated community codes, only for him to later find out no such code existed. Bit by bit, the stories piled up like a quilt of neighborhood abuse, stitched together by control and ego. So I compiled them. I sat down one evening with a notebook and wrote it all down, every name, date, story, and email. I collected photos, screenshots of her messages, even snippets from the HOAS online portal where she had left cryptic notes in the announcement section. Then I drafted an official grievance letter to the board. My tone was calm, precise, and documented like a prosecutor. I didn't rant. I didn't attack. I simply laid out facts: boundary overreach, unauthorized construction, abuse of HOA funds, and consistent behavior unbecoming of an HOA official. I attached a list of neighbors willing to speak on record. I didn't just submit it. I made 10 copies, one for each board member and one extra for the HOAS legal consultant. Within a week, Agnes was called to a closed-door review hearing. I wasn't invited, but I knew exactly what was being discussed. That same evening, a board member named Malcolm knocked on my door, looking somewhere between exhausted and impressed. "You really brought the receipts," he said. I asked him what happened. He just shook his head. "She denied everything, claimed it was all taken out of context. But then we showed her your drone footage, the survey reports, the neighbors' statements. She got real quiet. 3 days later, a notice was posted on the whole website, effective immediately. Agnes is suspended from all HOA leadership duties pending further investigation." The announcement was polite, clinical, and vague, but everyone in the neighborhood knew what it meant. Her reign was over. For the first time in years, people started smiling again when walking down the street. Some of them even waved. I got more cookies and thank you notes in 1 week than I had in 5 years. But Agnes wasn't done. With her authority stripped and her credibility in shambles, she pulled her final card, the lawsuit, or at least the attempt at one. I received a letter from a law firm I'd never heard of claiming I had engaged in character defamation and intentional sabotage of community leadership. The letter read like it was written by someone who Googled how to sue a neighbor and filled in the blanks with emotion. instead of evidence. Still, I forwarded it to my attorney just in case. He laughed and said, "This isn't even worth a reply," but I insisted on one. Not because I was worried, but because I wanted it on the record. Our response was short, sharp, and devastatingly clear. All actions taken by me were within my legal property rights. All claims were supported by documented evidence, and any further attempts to pursue false litigation would be met with a counterclaim for legal harassment and damages. We never heard back from that law firm again. As her final moves crumbled, Agnes's behavior became increasingly erratic. She tried to rally support online, starting a community Facebook group called Take Back the Garden, where she painted herself as the victim of a neighborhood-wide conspiracy led by a rogue surveyor. But only 4 people joined, 2 of whom left after reading her third all-caps post. She tried flying cars at the local grocery store. She posted vague complaints on Nextdoor about a man who weaponizes property law. None of it worked. Then, one morning, I saw something I didn't expect. Agnes stood on her now fenceless lawn with a single cardboard box in her arms. She looked tired, disheveled, and smaller somehow, like the air had finally leaked out of her bravado. She placed the box on her porch and sat beside it. A little while later, a real estate agent pulled up. There was no big sign, no fanfare, just quiet paperwork and a handshake. She was selling her house. Part of me expected her to storm over one last time, to shout something petty or sarcastic. But she didn't. She just looked at me once, nodded very slightly, then turned and went inside. The next day, a moving truck backed into her driveway. When she left, the silence was loud. The neighborhood felt lighter. Kids started playing outside again. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years stopped to chat. One by one, they came by with thanks. Some call me the guy who finally put Agnes in her place. But I didn't see it that way. I wasn't looking for war. I was looking for fairness, for balance, for peace in a place that should have been peaceful from the start. A few weeks later, the Hoa appointed a new board president, someone reasonable, transparent, and thankfully uninterested in personal power. They passed a new rule requiring all boundary-related projects to be reviewed by a third-party certified surveyor. No exceptions. When they asked me if I'd consider being that surveyor, I smiled and politely declined. I didn't need a title to protect my land. I just needed my boots, my maps, and a good camera. As for the fence, it never came back. In its place, I planted a row of sunflowers, tall, bright, impossible to ignore. Every time I look at them now, I remember that some boundaries don't need to be walls. They just need to be respected. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching the weeds leave on their own. The weeks that followed Agnes's departure felt like an entirely different universe. It was as if the entire neighborhood had let out a breath it didn't know it had been holding. Lawn chairs reappeared on porches, barbecues fired up on the weekends. And for the first time in years, people waved at each other without suspicion or tension in their eyes. The Hoa meetings, once stiff and performative, had turned into something almost normal. Questions got answered. Complaints were listened to. People actually laughed. Without Agnes's heavy hand on everything, the neighborhood finally started to feel like a community again. I thought that would be the end of it. The villain was gone. The fence had been removed, and the soil she had tried to claim as hers was now returned to where it belonged. But one quiet morning, as I was sipping coffee and reviewing some old project files, I got a call from the county records office. They had seen the viral blog post, had reviewed the footage I submitted, and wanted to confirm a few details about the boundary lines, specifically about the original easement agreement. I walked them through everything and even offered to send over my old plat. The woman on the line paused for a moment, then said something that made me blink twice. She told me that the easement along the back of my lot, the one Agnes had insisted was a shared community buffer, was never actually filed properly by the developer. And because of that, technically, it fell into a gray area. That might not mean much to most people, but to someone like me, it meant opportunity. I asked for the forms. Over the next few days, I filled out paperwork to finalize the land patent clarification. One submitted new documentation, certified surveys, and a formal request to have the easement dissolved, and the property lines recorded with precision. It wasn't about getting more land. It was about protecting what was already mine and closing the legal cracks that Agnes had once exploited. Within a month, the paperwork was approved. My lot was now fully documented, sealed, and legally immune to future boundary disputes. Agnes may have been gone, but her legacy of chaos had taught me that some things are worth bulletproofing. With everything finally in place, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years: host a neighborhood gathering. Nothing huge, just some burgers, soda, and a folding table under the old oak tree in my backyard. I sent out casual invites and waited. To my surprise, nearly everyone showed up. Even the people who used to side with Agnes came by, some a little sheepish, others full of relief. One guy, Ben, from 3 houses down, brought a cooler of root beer and muttered that he never liked how Agnes treated the hoa like her. Fiefdom. Another neighbor handed me a plate of homemade brownies and said, "You didn't just protect your yard, you reminded all of us we have rights." As the sun dipped and the grill sizzled, I looked around at the people gathered in what used to be contested ground. Kids ran through sprinklers. Dogs chased each other across the grass. And sitting in the middle of it all was a long wooden table I had made myself. A symbol maybe of how something broken could be turned into something useful. You see, when the fence was torn down, I didn't throw away the wood. I cleaned it, treated it, and repurposed the better planks into outdoor furniture. The table, benches, even the planter boxes along the path, all made from the very thing that tried to divide us. That irony wasn't lost on anyone. In fact, someone had taped a small note under the table that read, "The only thing this fence supports now is potato salad." Later that evening, a neighbor who worked as a local reporter stopped by. She had been following the Agnes saga and was curious to hear how it all ended. I gave her the short version, how the truth won out, how the law backed logic, and how you should never pick a land fight with someone who owns both the blueprints and the drone. She laughed and asked if I had any final message. I thought for a second, then said, "It's not about winning. It's about drawing the line once and making sure no one ever crosses it again." A few weeks passed. Summer turned to early fall. The sunflowers I'd planted where Agnes's sign once stood bloomed higher than I expected, casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. I added a new sign near the edge of the yard, not one that barked warnings or declared war, just a carved wooden plaque that read, "Respect the line." It wasn't just for property. It was a reminder for everyone in the neighborhood, myself included, that peace is only possible when boundaries are understood and honored. Then one day, a letter arrived from the new HOA board president, thanking me for helping restore fairness and transparency. Along with it came a small plaque, engraved with the words, "Community Guardian." It wasn't official or anything fancy, just a gesture, but it meant something. Not because I needed the recognition, but because it signaled that what once felt like a lonely, uphill battle had turned into something bigger, a shared understanding, a neighborhood that had learned the hard way what happens when one voice is allowed to shout over all the others. I still remember the first time I saw those fence posts going into my yard. That feeling of disbelief, of helpless anger masked by shock. And I remember the silence I kept for days while planning my response. Looking back now, I think that silence was my greatest weapon. Not yelling, not fighting in the street, just patience, precision, and persistence. Agnes thought her fence would mark her territory. What she didn't realize was that it marked the beginning of the end of her illusion of power. I'm not naive. I know someone like her may pop up again someday, in some other form. Power doesn't vanish, it just changes hands. But this time, our neighborhood will be ready. The bylaws are stronger. The records are clear. And if anyone ever tries something like that again, they'll find more than one person standing up to them. So I keep tending the yard. I mow. I prune. I patch the soil where the posts used to be. I walk the boundary line every few weeks, out of habit. Not because I'm worried, but because it reminds me how much ground was almost lost to arrogance. And every time I do, I see those sunflowers swing, tall and unbothered. Like they know they're exactly where they're meant to be. That's all I ever wanted, to know where I stood and to make sure it stayed that way. Turns out the best fences really do make good neighbors, but only when they're built in the right place. And if they're not, well, there's always someone around with a map, a camera, and the patience to remind people where the line is.